Hello and thanks for joining me. Now you may recall a few weeks ago I did a sunset shoot at the lake down in front of the house. I knew it was going to be quite complicated because there was going to be a colossal dynamic range to deal with and it was always going to need an exposure blend. Now I said on that video that if enough people were interested I would do a post-processing follow-up, so this is it. Firstly, let me apologise for taking so long to getting round to it, and secondly, what I should say is this is going to be about the principles that I use. It's not going to be a step-by-step walkthrough because that would take hours. So pull up a chair and let me show you what I did. Here we are in Lightroom, and I've selected from about the 50 or so exposures that I took a couple that I'm going to use for this blend. Now this first one here, as you can see on the left hand side, lots of foreground light with the vegetation backlit, and of course the sun was still pretty high at that point, so the highlights are completely blown out. The only bit I'm really interested in this are these foreground highlights and perhaps part of the sky. The other one is one taken just before the sun set. As you can see, it's right on the horizon. Now I specifically picked this one because literally just a couple of seconds later the sun had gone down, and at that point the foreground highlights that I had in the first exposure would look a bit silly if there's no light behind them. So I did need the sun in the frame, but as you can see, because I've got the exposure dialed right down, even the sun and the water reflections in front of it aren't clipped, and so it doesn't matter that the rest of the image is pretty much just silhouette. So the first thing I would do with either of the frames is a quick Lightroom process. As you can see, this is all I've done, just some very slight adjustments on these sliders, and in fact I've used a preset that I've developed over a period of time which takes advantage of the characteristics of my particular camera, and you could save yourself quite a lot of time doing the same thing for yours. So having processed one of them, I simply synchronize it across the other one, then select both exposures and go Edit in, Open as Layers in Photoshop. Now over here in Photoshop, as you can see, I've got the layers. Now ignore this one at the top, I'll come on to that shortly. But you start off with just these two layers, and then you want to go Edit, Auto Align Layers, and what that will do is it will line up the major components of the exposure that are fixed, so things like the fence posts and the boulders. Obviously the vegetation will have moved around a little bit between exposures. That doesn't matter at all in this instance. And now we get to the crux of this video, which is how I actually blend the layers. And in order to do that, we're going to use a luminosity mask. But let me start by just quickly explaining about masks. If we add a mask to this top layer, because the mask is white, the entire layer is visible. By then using a black brush and painting on the mask itself, we can hide this layer and make the layer underneath visible. Now if I turn this into a great big brush and bring through the sky from the dark version, and then drop my brush down and use the dark version for the water as well, as you can see we're starting to balance the exposure up. The problem with that, of course, is that it's next to impossible to get all those little details to work together between these two different exposures because they're so different. So it's never going to look natural. So that's the very basic principles of masking. Now the sort of mask that I'm working with is a special mask called a luminosity mask, and they're quite complicated to understand. So what I'm going to do is link to a really good article on the Petapixel website, and it's probably the most concise and easy to understand article I've ever come across on luminosity masks. So if you don't know what they are, go have a look at that. But by using a luminosity mask, and if I show you in my channels panel these different masks, as you can see they start off quite light and go down to quite dark. and the one I selected actually has very little masked out, and I'll show you. Just the area around the sun is blackened, and the area in the water where the bright sun is being reflected is also blackened. And what that means is that those areas on this really bright exposure are hidden, and that means that the areas from the dark exposure underneath are visible through that. So if we go back to here, you can see that that's a really rough blend. And there's some really bonkers artifacts because certain areas of the image below are showing through that I really don't want. But the easy workaround is to take this bright layer and reduce the opacity. And as that bright layer comes down in opacity, you can see the blend gets closer and closer. I actually ended up with the opacity at just 18% of my bright layer. That gave me enough of the bright layer to work with in these foreground areas, as you'll see when we take it back into Lightroom. So we came back into Lightroom from Photoshop with this version of the image with those layers combined. And the first thing that I did with this particular layer is a graduated filter. What I wanted to do with that is to darken that top layer of sky down a little bit. As you can see, I brought it down about 3/4 of a stop. And the next thing I did was a series of radial filters. I much prefer those to adjustment brushes because I find the transitions are much more subtle. So the first one is down here, and as you can see from the sliders, I've warmed it up, saturated it. I've brought the exposure up in this area by about 2/3 of a stop, and then I've also quite significantly boosted the highlights and the shadows. Now you would think that pulling that amount out of the shadows from a micro 4/3 frame would introduce a lot of noise. Well, it hasn't, as you can see, but also I deal with that a little bit later on anyway. So I'm really happy with that effect. I've done a very similar thing over here, but without the increase in exposure. And then a couple of other radial filters where I've dropped the exposure on this one because I don't like the water being too bright. And along here, a slight increase just in exposure, just to pull out these real highlights and the backlighting on those rushes. So with all of that done, we go back to Photoshop. So this is the final run through in Photoshop. Now I think I've talked about these particular filters that I used previously. So again, this is just about the principles, not the detail. So the first layer I would apply is a sharpening layer, and this is using frequency separation, which I covered in full detail in my video number 89. So if you don't know what frequency separation is, pop back there and take a look. The next one is using the DxO filters, Define 2 in particular, which is a noise reduction algorithm. Now I much prefer this to Lightroom noise reduction because I can target this, I can create different layers and different levels of noise reduction in different areas of the image. In particular in this instance, I was keen to reduce the noise in this gradient in the sky. The next layer up is another DxO filter called Color Effects Pro 4. And what I do with this is I have a blend of contrast filters, in particular dynamic contrast, and this really punches through the highlights and shadows, and I use it on most of my images. And I really like to use this as opposed to using tone curves within either Lightroom or Photoshop. So with all of those layers applied, I've then combined them into a merge layer. And then finally, for this particular edit, I've put in a little bit of red channel boost using a curves adjustment layer, only in the midtones and only in this area. As you can see, we were talking about masks earlier. You can see from this mask, I've masked out the upper area of the sky and some of the shadows because those are the areas of the image where I just wanted to pull a little bit more red out of what I'd captured. And then I finally merge all of those together. I had an airplane contrail and a load of midges flying around in this particular area that when I'd added the dynamic contrast stood out like sore thumbs. So I've just done a few little brush repairs to get rid of those and clean them all up. So we're all done in Photoshop. We're just going to pop back into Lightroom and a couple of adjustments just to finish it off. So all I did to finish it off is another grad filter with a really subtle adjustment and just the tiniest little reduction in exposure in this very top area. And finally 3 more radial filters, one over here just to pop the exposure up about half a stop, another one here, same sort of thing. And finally, just on this little edge here, I felt that the water was still a little bit bright, so I've just brought that down about 2/3 of a stop so I don't have a really highlighted area along the leading edge of the water, because I thought that was a little bit distracting. And that's it. That's how I arrived at the final image that I shared with you when I made that video a few weeks ago. Now, one thing I would say is that when I went out to take this image, I had a pretty good idea of what I would need to do in post-processing in order to create a final artwork. And that meant that when I was capturing exposures down by the lake, I knew what I was after. And it meant that when I came back, I had what I would need to work with. In particular, the foreground image with lots of really nice backlight, that was the key image, because it's really easy to wait until the sun's on the horizon and take your shot. The problem is at that point, everything down here is solid black silhouette. So important to get that initial shot in the bag. And if I hadn't known I was going to need that for my blend, I wouldn't have taken it, and the image wouldn't have had the impact that hopefully you felt that it had. Anyway, I hope you found that really useful. Going to leave it there for this one. I'm not sure where I'll be next time. Hopefully I'll be up a mountain. Well, thank you ever so much for watching. I hope you found it interesting. And if you did, why not subscribe now and join me next time. Cheers.